All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program for Maine Historical Society. I'm Lauren Webster, and it is November 6th, 2025. This is Sharing Stories with Sharon Kitchens and Hannah Wilber. Tonight, author Sharon Kitchens and editor Hannah Wilber will discuss how their work uncovers the haunting and historic landscapes of Maine through the lens of fiction and fact. Drawing from Sharon's two recent works, Stephen King's Maine, A History and Guide, and the second book, The Murder of Dorothy Milliken, Cold Case in Maine. We'll take a deep dive into the real places, people, and stories that have shaped both the chilling fiction and the unresolved truth. Look at the process of investigative writing, historical research, and the delicate balance of storytelling when fact and fear intersect. Sharon Kitchens has lived in Maine for a few decades. Her first book, Stephen King's Maine, A History and Guide, was published by the History Press in 2024. And her newest book, The Murder of Dorothy Milliken, is available now. You can read more every week at deliciousmusings.substack.com. Hannah Wilber is a writer, photographer, and freelance marketer based on the unceded Tiwa lands we know as Santa Fe, New Mexico. She's spent the majority of her decade-plus career helping colleagues in marketing and communications learn how to better connect with their audiences through stories that are relevant and resonant. Hannah collaborated with Sharon as a developmental editor on Sharon's two books. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Well, I guess, Hannah, why don't I'll begin just by kind of explaining how I came to do these books and with you and all of that. So I worked with Hannah there we go. Yeah, so I'd worked with Hannah prior to starting to work on either of my books, and I had found that she has an extraordinary ability to shape. At least this worked for me, to shape my writing and to help shape my tone, and rather than inserting herself into it, to bring me forward. So Hannah was basically providing me a map and helping me along the route. And so when I started to work on Stephen King's Maine, before I ever said yes to the publisher, I literally checked in with Hannah and said, "Will you work on this with me editing? Because I know that I will feel infinitely more comfortable if you can, be my editor." And she agreed. And that is how the journey began. And I guess I should also mention that when you're working with a small publisher like I was with the History Press for the first two books, and this is, I believe, probably from what I've heard, a similar situation with others working at very small presses, is that you're left to do a lot of the I guess extra work yourself. So you're not assigned an editor. That happens when you're at a larger firm. It's the same way that you have to be responsible for your own PR. Certainly there are people to help support at stages. But that was really a huge impetus for me being able to do the work, was to be able to have Hannah. So Hannah, I don't know if you want to say anything.
I'm flattered. I think Sharon always overcredits me in the incredible talents of her writing career. But yeah, so a little bit about my background. I've been in marketing communications my entire professional career, but the thing that I get most excited about and that I can nerd out for hours is what makes a good story, what makes us connect to a good story. What does storytelling do to our brains, right? It unlocks all these different neurochemicals and makes us more receptive, more empathetic, more likely to cooperate if we can become immersed in the story. And so I love to nerd out about that. And I have loved helping other people kind of learn a lot about kind of how to take those skills and apply them to their own writing. And so that's kind of how Sharon and I have been working together. But before there's any involvement from me, right, Sharon, you have to have an idea and you do a ton of work to get that to a place where you might want to collaborate with someone on shaping that story. And so I would love to hear kind of a little bit more about that process for you and how that's looked for your books and just kind of what are the nitty-gritty details of your solo work as a writer.
Yeah, sure. After I had made initially, so before when I was starting Stephen King's Maine, when I was talking to Hannah after she said yes, and then I went ahead and agreed with the publisher, I had already done an online story that had provided the basis for some of the information. I then had to go back and start from scratch. So that meant driving around Maine, interviewing people in small towns, going to libraries, hanging out at historical societies, and so on and so forth. So I spent an intense several months accumulating this research and then breaking it down into narrative. And then, so I think I probably went back and forth with Hannah a little bit talking about, but really some of the talking points, like how I was breaking it down. And then when I finally sent something to Hannah, it was a pretty rough draft. And then, yeah, but so I did that, I think. And then just to kind of, we'll get into the nitty gritty of that. With the murder of Dorothy Milliken, we'd gone through the process. So I was, I think, on my own. Like I wasn't sending Hannah as much, right? I think I sent you like bits and bobs here and there. Yeah. Especially where I felt like I was having more trouble. And I should say that now, so I'm working with an agent who I chose partially because she's such an excellent editor and her editing style is very respectful. It's very empathetic. It's a lot like Hannah's. And the way that works is that we go back and forth. We have a call like on a monthly basis or something around there. And I she has these chapters of mine, and she'll review those and say, okay, here's where we need to bridge this, or I need more information here, which is very similar to what Hannah was doing. So it's kind of like getting homework assignments. I then go back and I do that research, or maybe I've already done the research and I'm pulling that writing out, and then I'm inserting that text in. And in her case, she wants more rather than less to be able to, and Hannah, you can speak to this, but I think it's easier to remove than it is to add. And then just finally, so we're working on the proposal to go to the publisher. Once I get a publisher, I will then work with a different editor. So, there are a number of editors that are involved in the process. This is very much a team effort when anyone does a book. This is the same case for me. It's the same case for Stephen King. It's the same case for a lot of people. So, yes.
And I think it's important to clarify there's a lot of different types of editing that can happen along that process, right? So you heard in the introductions and what Sharon and I are kind of talking about now, we really worked on what's called developmental editing together, which is really kind of looking at big picture. What are the structure of your ideas? What is the overall message you're trying to communicate? How do you have that kind of clarity in your writing? There's of course, the fact checking editing and the legal editing and line by line copywriting. And at certain points, Sharon and I have also worked on kind of more of that fine-tuned flow and fluency of editing. But for the most part, because especially as for your third book now, like you said, you've got more players in the arena. We're in those early kind of informal stages of, hey, how does this idea come together? What are the parts that really need to be brought forth first? Where can you kind of play with tension and withhold some details for a reveal later, or plant a seed, but kind of organizing the ideas almost as if they're like post-it notes on your desk. That's the kind of editing that we're talking about. And I think it's really important to be able to feel like as an editor, I'm letting Sharon own that work. especially because, all this research you're doing, you are so much more familiar with the topic than I am. So when I step into that role, I am number one, honoring your expertise. And number two, like, I'm not trying to be the writer, right? I'm here to try and bring Sharon's voice forward more clearly. I'm not trying to turn it into my voice. And so that's this really interesting kind of balance we have to find of how do I make sure that I'm respecting Sharon's expertise, but also helping clarify the things that maybe are really clear up in her head, but haven't totally made it out into the order of ideas yet. And Sharon, I'd love for you to talk kind of a little bit about what that experience has been like for you.
Yeah. So I think, so first of all, I think an editor, their work should be invisible. So that's really a lot what you were talking about. And an editor should never take your voice away. So it's not even about like how much I know about something. I just have, I have a very conversational way of writing. I think that that would be accurate to describe. I'm also very fond of M dashes. And keeping a lot in my head. So, one of the reasons I wanted to work with Hannah is because she also knew that about me. Whenever you're working with an editor, that's a relationship that you have to figure things out. Like, people taking in information in many different ways. So for me, and this is just sort of I kind of going to cover some different ground here, but for me, I need notes in writing. That is what I respond to the best. I don't need many words. A lot of the time, Hannah's notes would be like, it might even be a question mark, or it might be like, what's next, or love this, keep going. And that's very similar to the way that my agent editor is working with me now. I think one of the things that's really important with the familiarity of the information or the expertise is, so when I'm writing a book about Stephen King, especially one that's going to go out nationally, internationally, and you want people to be reading it who don't have as much information, let's just say, about Mr. King or about his work, are not as familiar with his work as I am. And you want to be able to introduce people to that. You want people to read the book in advance who are not necessarily experts, because not all of your readers are going to be. You want to work with, in the best case scenario, different editors. So for me, at this point, I have, with this book moving forward, there's a friend of mine who is a retired German professor. And because fairy tales are part of the theme of the book, or what I'm using to organize the book, she's been incredibly helpful with educating me more about fairy tales, but also how they function in a larger adjacent narrative. And so at some point also, because Hannah is such a strong reader, she knows the difference between a good story and a bad story. Or I just want to say she knows when she spots a good story, because I don't think it's even fair to say what's a bad story. But so if when I send her pages from this book, it's going to be a response not to that expertise, but it's really a response to, how well did I tell that story? And for me, the bar is like what I always say about a great story is it a campfire story? Has it met that? Because I think that's when you're sitting around, this comes from childhood, from nostalgia, but you're sitting around a fire and the embers are, going up into the sky, and you're passing around the sticks with the marshmallows and the chocolate and all of that. And you're telling a story, and is it captivating people? And I think that's the measure of a good story is it captivating people? Are you enjoying it? Are you laughing? Are you responding? So that's always my goal. Can you read my stuff at the campfire?
When did you know on Stephen King's Maine that you had a good campfire story? When in the process did you have this like, aha, yes, I'm doing it kind of moment?
Yeah. I think it was definitely when I talked to the fourth generation gravedigger in Lisbon Falls. So I'm a strong interviewer. I love meeting people. I could talk to a lamppost. But I just love talking to everyday ordinary people. And this gentleman He owns a waste removal business, but he's also been hand digging graves for most of his life. And he did it with his father and he did it with his uncle. He's taught his son. And again, so he's fourth generation. And the reason just to give some context, the reason I was talking to him for Stephen King's Maine is because Stephen King had dug a grave by hand. He has grave diggers in his stories who are doing it by hand. And so it was really important to capture that small town character. And so when I went into his home and we're sitting there and the grandfather clock and, this pristine kitchen and the whole 9 yards, and he starts telling me this story and he's telling me about the mill where his mom worked. And he's telling me about how she made his bride's wedding dress. His bride, I love that because he's been married to his wife for, decades. And then he talks about with such beautiful pride about learning to dig this grave and get the corners just right from his dad. And it was the most beautiful thing. And so it felt like such a privilege to be able to, listen to that story, for him to share that with me. But then to know that I was taking that back into the book, I just knew, okay, wow, like I'm sharing something special here. Of course, it also, elevates, I don't want to even say but the pressure, right? Like you really, really and because that's really what my books are. It's not just me, it's all these people that I'm interviewing. And I want to do a great job for them, right? For them first and foremost. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's like a big responsibility to take on, right? And I feel like that percolates through with all of your collaborators on a project because it's not only are you responsible for it, but like if I come in and I'm kind of trying to evaluate like how is this interview fitting into the bigger message that you're trying to communicate, I want to be sensitive to the humanity behind that. And so I think there have been instances, Sharon, where I've kind of been like, hey, I don't know that this fits. And you've kind of stood up and defended it, right? And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you make those decisions of when do I listen to kind of the other creative voices that are coming in and when do I stand up for what I really believe the story needs to be told as.
Yeah. So I think first, everything starts with respect and to some degree negotiation, but first respect. So when I choose to work with someone to have them edit my work, I need to listen to them. And so with Hannah, with Mariah, who I'm working with now, when someone says, okay, I don't know if this fits, right? That's the hardest thing to hear. Sometimes you're like, oh, good, because I have way too many words, and I need to get rid of 10,000 of them. But sometimes it really is hard. It's not just, I want to move it over here. That I'm almost always fine with. But sometimes I feel really passionate, like with that gentleman who's the fourth grade grave digger, or with the book I'm working on now, where I have this section that I'm in love with that is We're the Readers. And it's a description that just flowed out of me one morning about who I am and who these other women constant readers are, who I'm interviewing. And ultimately, it's going to be the dedication of the book. I feel so strongly about it. But I said to my agent editor, I was like, well, we need to find a place for this. And fortunately, she said, yes, like this, we can do that. She doesn't, again, it's going to be like, it may not work right where I have it, but it can go in there. But I also read it to another woman who is one of the, when I say constant reader, it's a term that Stephen King assigns to his longtime readers. And she felt emotional about it too. So I knew I had struck a chord and I knew this was something that resonated with us. And so I'm going to fight, for that to stay in. It's the same way that I feel very strongly that fairy tales are the way to organize this book. I'm completely open to like the fairy tales themselves, like changing some of those out, broadening, chapters, so on and so forth. But I just think, usually, yeah, it's for me, it's like very few things that I just like, no, this has to happen. And then most everything else, I'm like, okay, yeah, this can stay, this can go, we can shuffle this around. Yeah. And I've heard that's absolutely how, when I've talked to other authors, how they've been as well. So
Well, and it makes total sense, right? Also, I have such weird light. It's very bright for me in this room, but on camera, I'm looking like I'm in a cave. So sorry about that. But
it's
I
okay.
think
My
one
voice
of
just got all scratchy, and I was like, "What is going on?" I'm just gonna go with it.
But I mean, you build such a relationship with these interviews, right? And I think from working with you, you especially, you really form close ties with folks and you stay in touch. And it's a real relationship you're building with people that goes beyond just, oh, let me get some information for this story I'm trying to tell. And I think that's really admirable. And one of the things I love most about your work is the humanity that's so present in it. I'm really curious for myself, like, how do you go about finding the folks that you want to interview, and how do you kind of make those tough decisions of for yourself who gets to stay and who doesn't fit?
Yeah. So, there's this term that someone used like way back when I started doing homesteading, which I did for 10 years out on the edge of King Country. Luck, pluck, and a lot of expertise or expert advice. And to some extent, it's a lot of luck. It's a lot of being in the right place at the right time. It's a lot of knowing people who know people. So with Stephen King's Maine, I think probably one of the first things that I did was I went into this cafe in Little River Coffee in Lisbon Falls, and I had a conversation with one of the women who owns that cafe, and I learned a lot just from that. So I knew from talking to her, okay, she's got to be in this book. Her partner's got to be in this book because her partner grew up in Bangor down the street from King, and just their involvement in the community. And then I found out about the historical center or the History Society in town. And so I thought, okay, history societies and libraries are no brainers. They are always a good idea. I mean, who doesn't want to spend time, honestly, at either of those places? Just going to be honest, because, like older people, I feel like are these walking libraries and just in general books, libraries. But yeah. And then one thing would lead to another. You talk to a librarian or you talk to someone at a historical society and they know someone. So, that was a bit more. I was also going into towns and just walking into places and saying, hey, I'm working on this. Do you know XYZ? Or I would talk to somebody who knew somebody in that town, or I read articles, and would just randomly find someone. I think that's how I found a gentleman that I talked to in Rumford. I definitely started out talking to people though, at like librarians, because he has librarians in his stories. So, and that was another thing with King's books is I knew what kind of characters he had. So I was like, okay, so he has people who dig graves, he has librarians, he has waitress, he has, right. With the murder of Dorothy Milliken, that was the case where I didn't have access to any of the police files. So I was working with the family, but I had to learn all about who Dorothy Milliken was. And so talk to the family, and then, interviews, names would come up. I was looking at archival newspapers, which are an absolute gift, from like really, I think probably up to like in the 1990s, they started limiting. But before that, like back in the 70s and the 60s, especially, I mean, if you had a neighborhood barbecue, there was like a list of who was there. Legit. Yeah. So I got, yeah, so it was just one of those things where, but like also with the murder of Dorothy Milliken, I knew that even though drugs did not play a part whatsoever in her murder, I don't believe, when I was starting out, I had to go down all the paths. So I literally was asking around people that I knew that had gone to school or knew anyone in Lisbon if they knew someone had dealt drugs, back in like the 70s. And I found someone and we met up at like an IHOP, in the middle of the day, and it was all fine. But it was, and then a lot of it is you talk to someone or you're on the phone with someone and they're like, oh wait, let me get my wife. And oh wait, let me get my sister. Let me do this. Oh wait, honey, just a second. You're standing in a parking lot. I've literally been standing in the parking lot talking to someone, and they start calling their family members like, oh, my oldest daughter is going to remember this. She'll want to talk to you. And then they put you on the phone. And then you're explaining to their oldest daughter why they're talking to a stranger in the parking lot. Legit, this happens. So with the book I'm working on now, which is about longtime female readers of Stephen King's work, and I am winding this down, but longtime female readers of Stephen King's work and the reflection they find in his stories, and specifically in his female characters. I know a lot of people in the King community. So Stephen King tours in Bangor, they posted a couple times on their Facebook page, and like I'm still getting people reaching out to me from that. But I also reached out to other people, and I'll read and find an expert, and I just reach out because I think I just don't know any better. Like, what does it hurt? So yeah, that's me.
Yeah. No, and I'm always just so in awe of the multitude of voices you're able to kind of bring in together to one story, which is just a really difficult thing to do, to weave it all together. And then you're combining that with all of this kind of static research that you're also doing, right? Like all of this reading. Can you talk a little bit about how you marry those two kind of very different material sources?
Yeah. So Susan Orlean, one of my favorite writers. So she has an online class somewhere. I think you were the one that maybe even told
We
me
took
about
it.
it.
Yeah, we took the
Yeah.
master class together.
Oh my God. Okay. I love that. So yeah, so I've done that a couple of times now. Plus I've read all her books and everything. But she has this thing where I love her for her exhaustive research, because I love research. That's like my favorite thing. And so she's basically like, once you're at a point where you're like answering all your questions and you're just going in circles, your research is done and now you need to write. So I always get to that point. It just might take me, however long. But okay, wait, I kind of went off the road here. So what was oh yeah, the books and the people. So it's well, like right now I'm rereading a number of King's books. So when I did Stephen King's Maine, I was reading the Maine-based stories, some of them, I mean, Needful Things, because he literally walks you down Castle Rock's Main Street. I mean, I read the whole book several times, but I read certain sections a dozen times. There's just layers and layers. So I'm doing the same thing to some degree now with so many of his books. Like I just realized in some of the interviews that I had done that I didn't remember this, but early on, there were a couple women who talked about the Dead Zone and 11/22/63. So I don't have to go back and read all of those books, but I'll go back and read, sections. Not that I don't love reading them. But I have a problem with books. I was just looking over at my bookcase.
You have an enthusiasm for books.
I have an
It's not a
enthusiasm for
problem.
books. Yeah. So, but yeah, I read everything. I go really wide with my research. And case in point, like with the murder of Dorothy Milliken, I mean, I interviewed over 4 dozen people. I was talking to people that the police never talked to. I was talking to somebody who worked the door at a club where some people had hung out at the night that Dorothy was killed and were then in the area later that evening. I talked to someone who used to own the laundromat. I talked to somebody who knew people who owned another business in the area. I talked to like a newspaper boy who wasn't like the newspaper boy in that neighborhood, but was in the adjacent neighborhood because I wanted to understand, what were they seeing at that time of the morning. So I try to talk to people because I want to get their perspective, whether it's place or time. That's what I love. Like that world building. So yeah.
What do you think
Answer
is
your
the
question.
hardest part from like transitioning from being in research collecting mode to then, okay, I've got my draft, I'm working with an editor, and we've got to actually turn all of this into the final story?
Yeah. So I've got Babs. She's my secret weapon. She's my big ass binder. And she's literally a 3-ring binder that's like this big. She's enormous. Yeah, it's like that. The binder itself is a whole story, but I won't get into that. But I have learned that I need to organize something so that it's ultimately going to be like the book. So I have, and this will change, but like I'll have the chapters. So right now I'm like, okay, these are the chapters that I think I'm going to have. So these are the sections. And then I have a section for books. And then I have a section for the interviews. And then I have a section for, um, you know, uh, miscellaneous research and this correspondence and so on and so forth. So that's how I do that. I then also, from Susan Orlean, I started working with, so I've got the yellow highlighter. This is my best friend, and of course my pens. And I'm a 3-ring, I'm a, notebook girl. So I have my to-do lists in my notebook. I guess that doesn't really help the process as much, but I work with index. So I have the binder, and then I'll like go through and highlight, say, the interviews. And I did this as well for both of the other books, but this was especially true for the first King book, because there's so much information coming from so many different places. So I highlight, and then I take that information and I'll take index cards and write kind of not clues, but like, here's one for accessibility, here's one for adaptations, here's one for carry, here's one for, whatever the heck. And that's how I start to map out what's going to go where. So like I have the chapters, and then I have all this information. And yes.
And at what point in that stage are you like, okay, I'm ready for Hannah or Monica or whoever to come in?
Yeah, yeah, or someone to look at it. Yeah, it's once I've got enough pages, really, like once I have something that's beyond a rough draft. It might be like a really, well thought out rough draft. And then maybe there's a couple sections where I'm still figuring, or like even a rough final draft. And there's some sections that I'm still figuring out. Like I might put, this is a rough area, and then I'll highlight it in a different color or something. Sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here, but we know I love doing the weeds. Yeah, so it's once I've got pages. So pages for me is generally like, I don't know, over 10,000 words for sure, probably closer to like 20,000 words that I can send, because I want to be able to give some context. It depends though, because like my friend Monica edited the choose your own adventure section in the back of the first Stephen King's Maine book. So I mean, I just sent her that just to, because she used to be an editor at a magazine. And so I wanted to just, how do you like the flow of this? Does that, yeah. So like with what I'm doing now, like with my editor agent is, I, we did the overview. And so there's just a couple parts of that I'm finessing. And now I'm working on one of the chapters and writing that out. And so I've got about 25 double spaced pages, but probably
So it's
15.
very much like section by section,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like, let's get
yeah,
this
yeah,
idea ironed out, tightened up, then we'll move on to the next one. Once you've kind of got the sense of how all of the different pieces are flowing.
yeah. It's more, I mean, my strong suit is definitely more like getting the research, getting it organized, and then it is slightly painful for me, trying to figure out how to put it, yeah, how to put that all. I mean, I love the writing, but getting it to that place where it makes sense. So that's where someone like you or this agent editor I'm working with is amazing, because you can say, okay, well, love this chunk or don't, but let's move it between these two. Or that was something that you were really helpful with me. I can't remember specifically what it was, but you're like, move this up. Because that's another thing that's really important about an editor is I get very emotional. I get very attached to the people and to stuff. Um, and then I'm like, I don't realize that the flow is not great for, say, someone who's not as attached,
Or
So
just that well versed in it, right? Like I remember this came up for us when I was looking at your early outline for A Murder of Dorothy Milliken, was you had this chapter where there were all these different men involved, but we don't meet some of them concretely until later, but we were introduced, like we were talked to as if they were very familiar. And I was like, okay,
yeah,
I know Sharon knows exactly who these people are, but I'm not privy to that information yet. But if I keep going, we'll find out. And so it was one of those like, okay, I needed this context to be able to understand why these people were in that scene.
yeah,
Um, But I think it's really important in those moments also that I leave room for elements of surprise that you might be building towards. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important from an editor perspective, is to always have trust in the writer and kind of wait to make comments. I think a lot of us, when we start out editing something, the inclination can be to just like start marking up the page. And I have to be really disciplined of like, give it an entire read first to get the full sense, and give like the writer a chance to really bring out their key message. And if I still don't get it by the end, then I know that there's some things that, maybe we need to massage around, bring more clearly. Maybe I get lost in something. Um, I'm curious, Sharon, from your perspective, how do you see the writer and editor coming to the table, and kind of what responsibility does each one have for each other?
yeah. So I think so that it depends with every relationship, but I think the ultimate responsibility of the editor is to make the writer's work possible to go out into the world. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about initially with that idea of expertise and how important is that with an editor. Um, I think one of the key things you've done is you've said, and this is also something that I've had with the person I'm working with now, is okay, that you'll see something like, because the person I'm working with now is not a King fan, right? They are familiar with his work, but they don't really read it. But they'll go, wait, this is really interesting to me though. But you've got it buried back on the 30th, page. I want to move it up here. So I think that for me, what's fascinating about what you're able to do is you're able to say, okay, the story is going to be this much stronger if we just, again, it's that shuffling, right? And it's literally less about even removing stuff. Although, of course, yes, that although the removing is helpful, because I think this is where it's really nuanced, is like for me, I either have too much that I leave in my head and then you need more on the page, or I'm giving too many details about, or, including something that's not relevant. So it goes back to what you were talking about, Hannah, where it's that shaping of the story, but it's also, you're not really leaving fingerprints, if that makes sense. So it's like your work is ultimately invisible. So Grady Hendrix, top 10 New York Times bestselling writer, one of my favorite writers. this is going to sound so naive, but I was talking to him one time. He's such a talented, sweet person. And I was talking to him one time, and he was talking about how his editor had, really been working on this one book. And I just turned to him and I was like, wait, you work with an editor? Because he's genius. Like he is literally a genius. He is so smart. And he's like, of course I do. What do you think? So that right there was like, oh, okay. So yeah, everyone needs someone like you to pull the best parts out and tell us where we need to go.
How do you know if that relationship is working, right? You've got this really personal, deeply researched stuff. You're carrying the responsibility of doing justice to the individuals you've interviewed. You have this wealth of expertise you've accumulated in your research, and now you have to trust someone else to come in and say, these are the changes you need to make. What does it feel like to know that like this is on the right direction, or like, actually this is not respecting the work in the way I want?
Yeah. So I think first of all, respect is like the number one thing. You have to feel like your work and you are being respected. You also have to do the same in return. The biggest issue that I have had with and someone who I choose not to work with as editing my work is that they put their voice. They change they change, like they just simply replace the words I'm using with words that they prefer, right? Um, and then it doesn't sound anything like something that I either wrote or would have frankly wanted to have written. And instead of things like that, or instead of saying, tell me more about this, they maybe they like do it themselves or something to some extent. So the idea is like to bring you to the water, not to like fill up the whole trough and, do the whole 9 yards. I think I've heard, so yeah, I think the big thing is about respect and about just, do you feel like this is a healthy situation? I mean, I've heard all kinds of wonderful collaborative experiences and not so much. So again, it really is a two-way street. I have heard about really great editors who have people that have asked them for their thoughts and then say, no, I don't want to take any of those. So what do what do you do then? Um, yeah.
I have one more question selfishly, and then I want to turn it over to our audience for some Q&A before we're out of time. But I'm just kind of curious, if anyone in our audience is thinking of being on the author route or anything like that. What advice do you have? What wisdom would you share? What have you learned that's been really important?
So I think that, you mean as far as being like a published author,
Or
or at least
pursuing that dream.
pursuing that dream. I think I think you have to have a good idea. So I think these are the big things. You have to have a good idea, meaning you have a good idea, but it's not just something five people, or maybe you are just writing a book for five people. Maybe you're writing like a recipe book for your family, and then that's great. But if you're writing a book for like the public, something you want to get out there, it has to be a good idea, something that other people are going to want to read. In theory, and I mean, I'm talking specifically more to nonfiction here. It has to be like, why now? And also, are you the right person to do this? Right? I mean, I'm not going to be writing anything about automobiles ever because I don't know the front from the back end. Like, I literally am like, I have no idea. So that's a no. And I think a huge part of it is it's a ton of work. So are you able to commit to that? And that doesn't mean that you have to, try to zoom it out in a year or two. But I think being able to like stick with it, because most of the people I know who start writing a book don't end up publishing it, even though they are the perfect person to do it. And it's a great idea. But they put it down. I know someone who was started to look for agents, and they got a couple of no's, and then that was, kind of it for them. But I hope they keep going because they have such a great idea. And yeah, so I think that's just, it's a lot of work. And I think, I mean, also Maine Writers and Publishers is a fantastic organization in Maine. They have a lot of really great workshops and resources. And they're a great way to find writers groups. Sometimes, that happens organically, but I wish I was part of a writers group. I've been spending more time with other writers, and it's been incredibly rewarding. So I think, finding your people in that way.
Find your people and stick with it, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for indulging me. But yeah, I would love to hear from our
Yeah.
attendees if there
So,
are.
so we have a couple of questions. This one refers to the murder of Dorothy Milliken, cold case in Maine. Um, how did you come to know about this case? And what, sort of empowered you to feel like you were the right author to write this book?
Okay, sure. So I did not actually feel like I was the right author. Let's start with that. So, yes. Okay. So what happened was I was turning in Stephen King's Maine to the History Press, and the person who I worked with there, they said, how would you think about doing this or this or this? And one of the things they mentioned, two of the things I was like, no, that I have no idea, no interest. And then the third thing they mentioned was cold case book. And I said, absolutely not. No way. That is, and this was when, I mean, I'd read like Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Like that was the extent of my, knowledge of anything remotely true crime. So I just thought that's macabre. I don't want to take advantage of anybody. And they made the argument that, okay, fine, but you are good at researching and finding people to talk to, so maybe consider it. And I was like, no way. So within the next 24 hours, I'm sitting where I am right now, talking to you with a cup of coffee in my hand. And Hannah knows when I get caffeinated, I get like, oh, wow, ideas. Anyhow, I'm a very, very curious person. That's what leads me to go out and to meet people. So I was like, well, cold case. So I didn't even know there was a cold case unit in Maine. That's how little I knew. So I Googled cold case in Maine. Sure enough, Maine State Police's cold case unit came up. And I thought, okay. So I went to the site, and you can search by location and you can search by date. So I searched by location, and Lewiston came up with, I think it was three, maybe it was more, but around that. Very few murders, unsolved murders. And Lewiston was just a place that I'd spent time when I was working on Stephen King's Maine book. And it's a place that I still enjoy spending time. And I really want to learn more about it. So I thought, okay, Lewiston. And then I knew I would never, and this is where my brain, I think, started to like churn and turn in like the different direction of, oh, maybe you could do this. It was, well, I would never do anything that happened in the last 3 decades, because I have no formal, I'm not law enforcement. I have no formal training. I would never want to get in the way and disrupt any kind of investigation or put anything in jeopardy. So that, combined with the fact that I've always been really into the 70s for like just the culture. So I just landed on Lewiston in the 70s, and that's how I found Dorothy Milliken. And I read the description that the state police had, which was that she was at a laundromat in the middle of the night on November 5th. She was actually murdered on November 6th, 1976. So 50 years today, next year. And I said, what in the actual was definitely not the word I used, was this woman doing at the laundromat in the middle of the night? And that is what got the ball rolling. So then I thought, okay, but like, so I started reading all these archival newspapers, right? And I just started writing down questions. I came up with like 100 questions before I knew it in my, just like this, spiral bound notebook. And then the next thing I did was I reached out to a couple of folks that I knew who, one was a former homicide detective. So a couple of guys in law enforcement. And I was 100% sure that they separately were going to be like, no, you should absolutely not do this. And they said, you should absolutely do this. So I then went and actually had like a coffee with the former homicide detective that I know and everything. And he said, you could bring awareness to the case. I'll put you, and then the other guy that I know was like, I can put you in touch with a sergeant, in the unit. So I ultimately got the Maine State Police approval, which they, I'm sure, later regretted. But anyway, they introduced me to Dorothy's daughter, Tanya. And because there was no way I was going to do it without the family's blessing. And so, yeah, so Tanya and I, we met, and so we were texting earlier today, actually. So yeah, still in touch. So yeah.
Thank you for
That was a
that.
really long answer,
No,
but
but but talking about the process of being a writer, and this is obviously a very sensitive subject, and not that long ago, Maine Historical Society has our notorious Maine Crime in the Public Eye exhibition. The dates of that go from 1690 to 1940. And the reason we ended the exhibition in 1940 was for sensitivity reasons. So hearing you speak to that and how you went through the process of discovery, research, discovery, and then encouragement, and then receiving essentially the blessing to do this book, I think is really impactful for a sensitive subject.
And it's also a case where I didn't plan to do this. And that can absolutely happen to people, especially with nonfiction, that can happen to people, but it can happen fiction too. So, yeah.
And then another question tonight. So Stephen King's Maine, A History and Guide, is available for purchase on the Maine Historical Society store. So if you're interested in that. But we had a question from a Stephen King fan, like top favorite thing that you discovered that you should not miss if you are in the area, travel guide style. What would it be for Stephen King's Maine?
Well, Stephen King tour in Bangor, that you cannot beat that. It is the best time. I mean, you get to ride around in a van with like a clown's face on the side, but also Jamie and Jennifer who run it, they have this awesome gift store. They're amazing. They know so much about King. His parents started it and have the blessing of Stephen King. They have this whole outdoor museum there. It's so well done. Yeah, so I think that, and also I would say going to Bridgeton, go to Bridgeton Books and walk around Bridgeton. So Bridgeton was used for The Mist and also for Under the Dome, and it's a quintessential small town. It's beautiful, but King has shopped in Bridgeton Books, and also Norway, Maine is another quintessential place to go. So yeah,
Right.
just driving around, like the visiting Rumford. I mean, if you ask me, it's all fun, but the Stephen King tour, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Love it when a good cultural and historical tour is suggested. I too feel the affinity for wanting to spend as much time at historical societies and libraries as possible.
Yeah.
Last question. Do you have a project that you're working on now?
Yes. So the one that I mentioned with that I'm working on with my agent. So this will be not a history press book, but a much larger book. And that is about longtime women readers of Stephen King's, who it's about the reflection that they find in his work, and specifically in his female characters. So,
Okay, excellent. And at what stage in the process are you with this book?
yeah. So I am working. my agent and I are working on the proposal for the publisher.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I've already done it. I've already interviewed a couple dozen really amazing women. And then also outside of that, I've also interviewed a number of people who are um, experts in varying degrees. So yeah.
I'm really excited about this one, just from the little bit that I've gotten to see behind the scenes. Like, it's really the stories that are coming forward and the way that you're treating them. I'm just like, ah, this is going to be such an incredible, empowering read. So I hope everyone keeps an eye out for it as it comes together because I'm so stoked.
So, as am I. Thank you so much. So, Sharon, Hannah, thank you so much. And everyone who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for joining us this evening for sharing stories. We really appreciate your participation and your questions. This recording will be available in a couple of weeks on the Maine Historical Society website, which is mainhistory.org, as well as on YouTube. So, thank you all again for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.